Good morning, everyone. We're in Perek Yud Bet and Sefer Nechemia. We're coming up towards the end, and in this final section, really what's happening is everything's coming together. So we're returning back to an earlier phase when Nechemia had built the walls. Yerushalayim was going to start being once again its center, its structure that it had been before, and in the same idea of that, with all of that happening, we have to sanctify the walls, which is what Perek Yud Bet is about. So we're gonna make this work. We're gonna make this work. Everyone is just getting back on again. Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Aleph. Now, one more disclaimer: this perek doesn't sound like the most exciting of all prakim in Sefer Nechemia. There's a lot of names, a lot of lists, and a lot of places. What I want you to notice, though, is when you look at the names and you look at the roles, you're going to see that the Kohanim don't have as central of a role as the Leviim do. And this is something that Dov Zakheim points out in terms of a political shift that's taking place, all part of Nechemia's goal, because Nechemia, as you recall, had a problem with the Kohanim. Many of those Kohanim had intermarried. Many of those Kohanim were resisting the democratization of Torah learning. And as a result of all of those things, what ended up happening was the Leviim rise in power. They're more of Nechemia's people, even though Ezra himself was a Kohen. So let's just get started. We'll get into it. Hopefully the distractions will go away as the doors close and everything else happens. Yeah, Leah, before we get started. Well, we see that later in Jewish history when we have, remember, we said at the beginning of at the end of the Amanah, where Nechemia instructs the people to remove themselves Prushim from not Prushim, Hibadlu, where they talk about separating themselves from their non-Jewish wives. That's the beginning of the Pharisees, the beginning of the Prushim. So the Prushim and Stukim are a clear point of conflict between the Kohanim and the rest of the Jewish people. Now, if you take the Kohanim out of the mix, the Leviim were the next level ritual functionaries or religious functionaries in the group. And so in terms of clear conflict, the end of the period of the second Beit HaMikdash, you actually had war that was taking place between these groups. And part of the reason why the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed.
You say the Kohanim were the only Pharisees?
The Kohanim ultimately will be the source of the Sadducees, of the Tzedukim. The Pharisees, for whom we are descendants, which is also the same because we're part of Rabbinic Judaism, the Pharisees were the people who were part of this movement of Ezra and Nechemia to spread Torah and to give the opportunity for everyone to be in a role of Torah. Part of the various takanot, of the various decrees and legislation that Ezra and Nechemia passed was to shift the balance of power away from the Kohanim. The Kohanim had, unfortunately, up until this time, pretty much complete control over Torah. They were the teachers. They were the ones who possessed the power. They were the ones who were the religious go-between, almost, between the regular person, the regular Jewish person, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And part of what Ezra and Nechemia did in their various changes that they made were, for example, when they changed the alphabet. Part of that goal is to allow more people to be able to access Torah. When they went to the Assyrian alphabet, when they made sure that, for example, we read about, and we'll see at the end of this perek, that the gifts that were supposed to go to Kohanim, the various portions that are given to Kohanim, when we see that they're being brought directly into the Beit HaMikdash, was to be more democratic in that division as well, as opposed to taking care of your favorite Kohen who lived around the block. So there's a lot of changes that's happening. Second Commonwealth Judaism is going to be very different than the first Commonwealth. Second Commonwealth being the second Beit HaMikdash time. And it's going to lay the foundations for what we have today. The major difference, obviously, what we have is post-temple. We don't have a Beit HaMikdash, so there's not that same centralized piece around Yerushalayim as they had in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. So if you just look at the opening of the parak, you'll see that it says, Ve'ela Kohanim v'Levim asher alu im Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel veYeshua. These are the Kohanim who came up in the earlier time with Zerubbabel, together with Yeshua. Yeshua is the Kohen Gadol. So these are the families. And the families are Sraya, Yirmiyah, Ezra, Amarya, Maluch, Chatush, Shechanya, Rechum, Merimot, Ido, Gintoy, Aviyah, Miyamin, Adaya, Bilga, Shmaya, V'Yoyariv, Yedaya, Salu Amok, Chilkiah, Yedaya, Elu Roshei HaKohanim V'Achem B'Yimei Yeshua. This is the list of the Kohanim in the time of Yeshua. Now, the reason why this is a significant list is we see originally when the Kohanim came, they were divided into 4 families. At this point, all of a sudden, we're now up to 22. And the 22 families are subdivisions, apparently, of that first group of 4. The first 4 were Yedaya, Yeshua, Pashchur, Imer, and Charim. Now, the reason for this significance, or the reason why this makes any difference, who these Kohanim were, is really going back to the fact that these 4 Kohanim who started, it wasn't a sufficient division to be able to manage what was necessary. We moved over, if you recall, in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, the Gemara and Tani talks about this, we moved over to a rotational system based on 24 weeks. These were called Mishmarot. David HaMelech had done them. And as a result of those 24 Mishmarot, we had constant service and constant coverage in the Beit HaMikdash. The 24 weeks, there were Kohanim, Leviim, who were serving, and there were representatives of the regular Jewish people who were also present in the Beit HaMikdash. From 4 to 24 is something you can manage. If you keep the Jews listed at just 4, it's more complicated in the same fashion. V'haleviim, and the second group of people who were already a Pasuk Chet, just to be clear of what's going on here, the Leviim who were part of this were Yeshua, Binui, Kadmiel, Seravia Yehuda Matanya, Ala Hayudot, Huvechav. And Matanya was responsible for prayer. Yuduot, okay, this is Lahodot LaHashem, for example. The Ibn Ezra says that they were the ones who were responsible for all of the various prayers that were offered in the Beit HaMikdash. The Malbim disagrees, and the Malbim says if you look at this pasuk, you notice that from the Trup, under the name Mitanya, there's an etnachta. Now, an etnachta means it's a hard stop. It's the equivalent of almost a period. It's, the end of a pasuk is a period. Whatever you would say is a step below a period, not even a comma. It's above a comma. And so the etnachta really means you stop here. So according to the Malbim, if you look at this pasuk, what you notice is there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 names up to Yehuda. And then Mitanya is where you have the hard stop, number 6. It would seem to be, says the Malbim, that Mitanya, therefore, is part of that early part of the pasuk and shouldn't be attached to the latter part of the pasuk. The latter part of the pasuk, which starts Allah Hu Yidot Hu Ve'achav, okay, over the Hodaya, over the praise, he and his brethren. So the Malbim has an issue with this. It would seems to be that there are 6 Kohanim, 6 Leviim who are managing the praise. According to most of the Meforshim, Mitanya is the one who's managing the praise. And then we have one more piece, Uvak Bukya V'uni Achem L'negdam L'mishmarot. And then these last 2 groups, they're the ones who are responsible over Mishmarot, over these rotations that took place. We see the structure. 22 Kohanim are present. We have 8 different Leviim who are mentioned. That's the hierarchy at the time when Zerubbabel comes back to Eretz Yisrael during the high priesthood of Yeshua. One thing that is very interesting, the Malbim points out, that of the list of the Kohanim who were in the beginning of this parak, there were 6 of them who didn't sign on to the covenant on the Amanah, which we read about a couple prakim ago. Those 6 who didn't sign on, interestingly, they may not have bought into all of the change. And it may be where we see that there's this division between the Kohanim themselves. We have the Kohanim who, signed on with allegiance to Ezra and Nechemia, and apparently there's some Kohanim who didn't. And we know there were Kohanim who intermarried, for example, and they could be among those. We don't have all of that information. We just see, when you look at all the lists, you see the differences. The Yeshua holid et Yehoyakim, and Yeshua, the Kohen Gadol, he gave birth to Yoyakim. The Yoyakim holid et Eliashiv, and he gave birth to Eliashiv, right, his wife did. Eliashiv et Yoyada, and Eliashiv's son is Yoyada. The Yoyada holid et Yonatan, and Yoyada had Yonatan. The Yonatan holid et Yadua, and then Yadua. So we have the list of 6 Kohanim Gedolim. Now, the reason why 6 Kohanim Gedolim is really interesting to have this list is a couple of things. First of all, we'll see later in the parak that there's someone who shows up by the name of Yochanan. And there are modern scholars who want to suggest a typo here, that Yonatan here really should be Yochanan. It's the same person. And we'll see, because it's talking about him being the son of Eliashiv. Now, if you notice in our list, Eliashiv's son was Yoyada, and Yoyada's son was Yonatan. So there's all different ways of resolving it. We'll get to that in a minute. But the bigger problem here is a problem of 6 Kohanim Gedolim. Now, why is it a problem? Because according to Chazal, the entire Persian period was 34 years long. Remember that chronology thing we keep on coming back to, of how many years was the Persian period? If we say it's 34 years long, then we have a big problem. Why do you need 6 Kohanim Gedolim? But not only why do you need 6 Kohanim Gedolim, how can you fit 6 generations into 34 years? It really doesn't seem to work well. Zerubbabel had Yeshua, we know, as the Kohen Gadol. And between Zerubbabel and the end of the Persian period, how do you get all 6? And so this is one of those areas where historians say that Chazal collapsed the Persian period, that it was more 165 years based on the documents that we have from archaeology, based on the historical evidence that we have. On the other hand, Chazal got very creative in how they were going to collapse it, including saying that Yeshua, when he was in his role, he was already 90 years old, and he started collapsing the generations, but it's still a very tough thing to do. Yeah.
Who chooses the next Kohen Gadol?
The next Kohen Gadol is chosen generally by the leadership of Klal Yisrael, but often you would see that it wasn't hereditary and didn't have to be father, son, father, son, father, son. Often was, but wasn't always. Okay, it had to be obviously a Kohen. Yeah, Jim.
I thought the Kohen could only work till they were 50.
Ah, nice little problem there, huh? Okay,
But
so
he was Kohen for 40 years.
right. So whether they were okay, so there were all sorts of problems with the numbers, and that 34 years we've dealt with it at length on numerous occasions. On the one hand, Chazal say it. On the other hand, how do you explain it? Okay, how do you explain it with this, even with 6 Kohanim Gedolim? And sometimes it feels like you have to do 30, all sorts of somersaults. For example, the Malbim wants to suggest that when Yeshua came back with Zerubbabel, he was already 105 years. He says that each one of the Kohanim Gedolim who are listed had their child when they were 15 years old. And it's possible the Kohanim Gedolim were chosen when their father was still in office. So you notice those somersaults are complicated. But whatever it is, we see there are 6 Kohanim Gedolim. The Kohen Gadol that we dealt with at the beginning of the parak was Yeshua. Then the next piece we have, Uviyamei Pasuk Yud Bet, Uviyamei Yoyakim, And in the time of Yoyakim. Now, Yoyakim, if you notice, okay, let's see who he is. Yoyakim is the son of Yeshua, right? So the next generation, Hayu Kohanim Roshei Ha'avot. Then we had Kohanim who served as heads of the families. These are the 22 families. And now we're actually going to list the names of the Kohanim who were in charge of each of these 22 families. And I'm just going to go through it quickly because I'm going to go through it quickly. Okay, who were they? Lisraya, Miriah. To the family of Sraya, who we've dealt with before, we saw him in Pasuk Bet. The head of that family in the next generation, his name was Miriah. LeYirmiyah Hananiah. The family of Yirmiyah was Hananiah, was the person of Lezra Meshulam. So if you look at the beginning of the parak, you look at this parak, you start seeing the transition of power. Lezra Meshulam, Lamariyah, Yehochanan. Amariyah Yehochanan. Limlichu Yonatan. Lishavnaya Yosef. Lecharim Adna, Lemerayot Chelki, Leido Zechariah, Leginton Meshulam, Laviyah Zichri, Leminyamin, Lemod Adaya Piltin, Levilga Shamua, Lishmaya Yonatan, Leyoyariv, Matnai, Leyedia. Uzi, Lesalai, Kalai, Lamok, Eva, Lechilkiah, Chashvaya, Lidiyam, Netanel. Okay, so these are the 22 families, the people who were in charge. Why do we need the lists? Well, part of the purpose of Ezra and Nechemia is to establish also the question of yichus, of next generations, of continuity, of how we're building. And you need to have these names there. For us, it seems like a list of names. For their mothers, if their names were off, we would have gotten in trouble. Okay, that was just a moment of smile. Next, now, just like we had before, where we had the Kohanim and then the Levium, HaLeviim b'imei Eliashiv, the Levium who served in the times of Eliashiv. Now, Eliashiv is the third generation, Kohen Gadol. Yoyada v'Yochanan v'Yadua Ktuvim Roshei Avot v'Kohanim al Malchut HaYavesh HaParsi. And these Kohanim and the Levium in the times of Eliashiv, apparently meaning that the Levium who served in the first two generations were the same people, that the first transition of power in Levium happened in the third generation of the Kohanim Gedolim, and that's why we mention them now. They're reported. This list is found. Al Malchut HaYavesh HaParsi was in the formal legal records. The census of the Persians had this information located within it. Pasuk Chav Gimel. Pasuk Chav Gimel says, B'nai Levi Roshei Avot Ktuvim al Sefer Divrei Hayamim. Now we also see that the Levium who were in charge, they were also recorded in the Chronicles of the Jewish people, Va'ad Yochanan ben Eliashiv, and up until the time of Yochanan ben Eliashiv. Now, the interesting thing is, and you may find it interesting or not, Yochanan ben Eliashiv, if you look, we don't have, back in Pasuk Yud, Eliashiv's son was Yoyada, and Yoyada's son was Yonatan. There's not a Yochanan on that list. And so there's two different ways of explaining it. The easiest way of explaining it is saying Yonatan, Yochanan, it's the same thing, same guy, same person. Whether you say it's a mistake or they were known by two names, Malbim says they were known by two names, but we have another problem then. If I say that Yonatan and Yochanan are the same, Yonatan was the grandson of Eliashiv and not the son of Eliashiv. So then we,
Possible that there was a different Eliashiv.
The Eliashiv is referred to as the Kohen Gadol. So we know for sure who the Kohanim Gadolim were. That's a limited number. So the other way of explaining it is, no, Eliashiv had a son who was the Kohen Gadol. His name was Yoyada, and he had another son named Yonatan.
But if you were writing something within 20 words, would you change somebody's name?
No, right. So that's why, that was what the Malbim is saying. The Malbim say we don't see Yonatan, we don't see Yochanan, we do see Yonatan. Yonatan is related to Eliashiv, he was the grandson. Sometimes we'll call grandsons sons. We find that elsewhere in Tanakh, not such a big problem. Fine, it's the same name. Okay, the problem is it's not the same name, it's a different name. And so as a result, it could entirely be, okay, that this Yonatan was another son of Eliashiv, a different person. Eliashiv, we know there's a limit because 6 Kohanim Gedolim. Every other person, we've had a list of 22. We had another list of 22 from a generation later. We had a list of 8 Levium. We have another list of Levium. Okay, so you have additional persons popping up. Possible, not necessary, but possible. And as a result of it, we say that this is Adime Yochanan ben Eliashiv, V'roshei Leviim, who were the heads of the Leviim, Chashavia, Sheravia, Yeshua ben Kadmiel, V'achem Lenegdam, and this was the first group. Lahalel lahodot b'mitzvat David Elokim. They were responsible. Okay, they were responsible to, as we'll see, to sing. They were the ones who were giving. They were the choir. They were the ones who were davening. Mishmar lumat mishmar. There was one group opposite the other group. Matanyahu Bakbukya, Ovadia, Mishulam Talmon, Nakuv, Shomrim, Shoarim, Mishmar, Basufei Asharim. And then there was another group who were responsible for the gates. They maintained the gates within the Beit HaMikdash. These are Levium functions. Eile b'yimei Yoyakim ben Yeshua ben Yotzadak b'yimei Nechemia Pecha v'Ezra Kohen HaSofer. These were the functionaries who served in the time of Ezra Nechemia. Okay, we got the list out of the way. Now, again, the significance of the list is really to show continuity and rebuilding. There is a lot of details you can get into in all the names. Yonatan was just one small detail that was really big of all the small details. But the main seeing that things are getting set up again, that there's a government that's working, that there's a ritual service that's beginning to work, everything's being set up. And once this is set up, we know the Beit HaMikdash will be able to continue to operate. Without it, we don't have the operations. But the main purpose of this parak starts from Posuk Chav Zayin, or at least for our purposes, the main piece. Yeah.
And it's like with the rabbi.
Yeah,
We don't have it.
we don't have rabbis.
Not until
Well,
300-400
so
years after this.
not. I'm gonna hedge a little bit on it. Daniel Elazar has a wonderful book called Jewish Polity, which talks about the structure of Jewish community from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and until modern time. And he always talks about that there are 3 sectors. Okay, there is, you have the priest, you have the rabbi, and you have the politician. Those are the three. It's a triangle always. There are times where people assume both. So tragically, the Kohanim, for example, in the time of the Chashmonaim, took over the role. Okay, the Kohen also became like the king. That was a tragedy that occurred. Earlier, you had, originally you had Moshe, you had Aaron, right? Moshe originally was also the king. Moshe was also the teacher. And so the role of the teacher throughout Jewish history has always shifted. The rabbi, in that sense, has shifted with different functionaries. The title rabbi really is a later title. We use, the title which we use, rabbi, probably the closest we start having is in the Tannaitic era, where we use that title to indicate that someone had smicha. But it was the original smicha, not like the smicha we have of today. And we use that kind of title. It wasn't.
But we refer to the smicha that comes from Moshe.
Right.
That's way before this.
Well, the smicha that comes from Moshe continued. Well, so in the Tannaitic era is when we start encountering people, Rabbi Akiva, for example. Okay. Rabbi, the only place you could get smicha was in Israel. So typically, anybody who had the name Rebbe or Rabbi, really is the real way of saying it, they were rabbinic leaders from Israel, and they were the people at that time who were in their functions. In Babylonia later on, we'll see the title Rav. which was not rabbi. It means they didn't have smicha. That means they served the same function, but because they were outside of Eretz Yisrael, they didn't receive the smicha. So you have Rav and Rebbe. That's one of the ways sometimes to identify between a Babylonian and an Eretz Yisrael. Very often, it's also the big difference between Tanaim and Amoraim, and I'm way off subject on this one. But the religious leadership at this point, religious leadership was in the hands of Kohanim, transferring over to Levium as well, and we'll see the continued transformation.
Political.
Political, actually, Nechemia is the political leader. He's the appointed, as we just said in this pasuk in Chavav, Uvimei Nechemia Hapecha. He was the pasha. He was the governor appointed by Daryavesh over the region of Eretz Yisrael.
I think in these days, perhaps, the concept of religious versus political wasn't as separate as it is today. It's got to be a little bit closer.
Well, no, because we really had. It could be closer, but there was separation. It wasn't the wall, the separation wall like you have in the United States. Okay, but there was separation. There were different people who functioned in those roles. Kohen Gadol was not the political leader. Okay. And you'd have the political leader was generally from the Davidic dynasty. Often as well, a person who was, appointed by a foreign power in the time of the Second Commonwealth, when we didn't have absolute freedom. Yeah.
Last time. When Moshe gave the bracha to Levi, he said, Israel. So wasn't he giving him religious authority to be a teacher and also some legislature?
Oh, and we find it more in Sefer Devarim also. Moshe, right? That was the role of Shevet Levi. And it was the religious leadership. It's the reason why Levium didn't have their own independent area, but they were spread out in 48 cities all over Eretz Yisrael, because if you need to have teachers and leaders, it doesn't make sense to only be in one place. You need to be all over the place. Okay, think Chabad. If you have to have, if you need to have people who are going to dedicate their lives to the Beit HaMikdash, you need Kohanim. The question was it exclusive, or was it going to be an inclusive kind of religious leadership? There was a while where it turned into an exclusive kind of leadership. I'm going to go back now to where I really want to get to, and this is the Chanukat Chomat Yerushalayim. Now, the walls had been built. Goes back to Perek Zion. Okay, the walls were built, everything was set, and they wanted to dedicate the walls. It's something that's very unique. Interestingly, in recent archaeological excavations in Israel, they discovered a similar concept of dedicating walls. We dedicate a Beit HaMikdash, but to dedicate walls seemed to be very strange. There is one archaeological excavation they found where they dedicated the walls. So the dedication of the walls is going to be done through a ceremony. And a lot of this, up until 100 years ago, was very hard to imagine, because the ceremony is going to involve people parading on top of the walls. Now, when they uncovered what we know in the old city as the broad wall, all of a sudden you see the width of this wall, and you realize that you could really march on top of the wall 2-3 wide. And so it all begins to make a lot of sense, this description. And the way the march is going to go, and this is the map that I sent and the map that I gave everyone, okay, you're going to see there's going to be one group going this way and one group going this way. And they're going to meet in the Beit HaMikdash. One group is going to be led by Ezra. One group is going to be led by Nechemia. Each of the groups will have singers and musicians and offerings. It's going to be a big procession. And they're going to start basically from down at the bottom of the city, which is, if you look at this map, this area, we call it Ir David. Okay. We know where Ir David is today. It's in Ir David. It's the top of Silwan. Okay. This is the area of the Beit HaMikdash. And if you look, you can see the current walls of Yerushalayim are this light outline around this area here. Okay, so the current walls are the solid line, that's the thin solid line. These are the walls at the time of Ezra and Nechemia, the walls that we're going to be dedicating now. So if we take the psukim And we say as follows: "V'chanukat chomat Yerushalayim, bikshu et haLeviim mikol mikomotam." The Leviim were called to Yerushalayim from everywhere where they were. Now, the significance of Leviim being called to Yerushalayim is, remember, there were a paucity of Leviim available. Not a lot of Leviim made Aliyah, but we wanted to make sure that they were in force. And this goes back, according to Zakheim, goes back to the idea that Nechemia really wanted to solidify the role of Leviim versus Kohanim. Kohanim are necessary, but he wanted the Leviim to step to the fore. Laviam Yerushalayim, to come to Yerushalayim, Lasot Chanukah, to make the dedication, V'simcha, and also the joy that was necessary. We'll see Simcha is going to be a word that's repeated over and over again. Uvitodot uvashir, and they're going to be bringing the offerings of lachmei todah, of the breads of thanksgiving, and with song, mitzil tayim, they're going to be using cymbals, nevalim v'chinorot. A nevel is like a harp. A chinor is a smaller kind of instrument. Nowadays, a chinor is a violin, but it's another string instrument, a smaller one. Ve'yasfu b'nei HaMishorerim, and those who were responsible for the singing, the choir of the Leviim, umina kikar svivot Yerushalayim, they brought them from the areas outside of Yerushalayim, the Mishor, the valley areas outside of Yerushalayim, umin chatzrei natofatai, and they also brought them from the area of Chatzrei and Natofatai, which is around the area of Beit Lechem, south of Yerushalayim. But they also brought them Umi Beit Gilgal. They also brought them from Beit Gilgal, which is to the east, Gilgal being near Yericho, Umistot Geva v'Azmavet, and also from the areas, the fields of Geva, which was in Binyamin. Okay, today there's an Arab village, Jabba, there. The Azmat, and this is today also in Binyamin. It was always in Binyamin, a little north of Yerushalayim. It's called Beit Azmat, which we had earlier in Perek Zion as well. And nowadays it's called Chizma. Okay, and again, it's an Arab village. Because they built for themselves their areas. They had their own neighborhoods. Svivot Yerushalayim, all around Yerushalayim. Now, it makes sense that they weren't necessarily in Yerushalayim because they didn't have to be there full time. There was this rotation that took place. Vayitaharu HaKohanim v'haLeviim, and the Kohanim and Leviim made sure they were purified. Vayitaharu et ha'am, and also the people. V'et ha'sha'arim v'et ha'choma, and this is fascinating because this we really don't have precedent for. They also went and they purified the walls and also the gates. Ve'aleh et sarei Yehuda. And now Nechemia begins talking. It shifts into the first person. I brought up the leadership of Yehuda, okay, to the place me'al l'choma, on top of the walls. Ve'amida shtei todot gedolot, and I brought up two great many is another way of saying it, todot. Rashi, following in his approach, says this was the offering of the Korban Todah, which was a bread offering. Interestingly, the Ibn Ezra disagrees with him, and he says no. Ve'amida shtei todot. He brought up two groups of people who would give thanks. It's like the Thanksgiving choir, let's call them. So, v'tahaluchot liyamin me'al choma, and we began to go to the right. Now, to the right means from the north to the south. Right is, if I look, and this is why it always gets people a little confused. Whenever we turn in the Beit HaMikdash, whenever we do any kind of turning in Jewish life, we always go to the right. Now, what does it mean to the right? The right is counterclockwise. How does the right become counterclockwise? People get confused by this all the time. For example, under a chuppah, the kala goes around the chosim, counterclockwise. When we take a Sefer Torah from the Aron Kodesh, you're supposed to go counterclockwise in that direction. Because when they would walk around the Mizbeach, on the outside of the Mizbeach, the turn was always to the right. So if you're walking around something led by your right, that means you're going counterclockwise. If I'm led by my left, then I'm going clockwise. Okay, always counterclockwise. Even when you turn, I remember talking to Rabbi Tendler Zal once when he was doing Kins, and I asked him, I said, during L'chadodi, when people turn around, which way should they turn? And he looked at me with incredulous. He said, we always turn to the right. Kol hapinot shel Panei Adam liyamin. The Gemara establishes is always counterclockwise. And that's the way in the Mizbeach, for instance, when they would sprinkle on the Mizbeach, they would always go counterclockwise around the Mizbeach.
It matters, but here I am. I go to the right and going clockwise.
No, that's where it always gets people confused. You have to look at yourself on the outside. Imagine a Mizbeach.
Somebody looking at me.
Imagine I'm facing the Mizbeach. I'm facing, okay, here's the Mizbeach, is the square of tables. I'm on the outside facing, and I turn right, it's counterclockwise. That's where people always get confused. Always, believe me, you could try it. Sometimes I do it, okay? If you stand up, I'll stand up for a moment for those of you, okay? Here is, the Mizbeach is in front of me. I'm going to my right, I go this way. And then I keep on, then I turn and I go this way. So it's counterclockwise on your right. Believe me, you can try it later. It works really.
The way I just saw you.
Yeah.
Counterclockwise.
Right.
To you, you were clockwise.
No,
I saw you as.
no. Counterclockwise is not relational.
Yeah.
Counterclockwise is not relational. Okay, you're thinking left, right are relational directions. Believe me, you can try it. It works, believe it or not. So if I'm going to the right, and if you look on the map that I gave you, and I'll bring the map up, those who may not have pulled it up themselves on the screen. If you look on the map, we're down at the bottom of the map, okay, and we're looking here, Valet Sarayuda, okay, and huh? Okay, I'm gonna be going south, going counterclockwise south, okay, and we're gonna get a little bit of direction here. And what happens is he's on top and he's going, Shara Ashpot is all the way at the tip, at the bottom. The bottom of the map is Shara Ashpot. Little hard to see because of the colors, but you'll see at the bottom piece, right by Brechat HaShiloach, by the Shiloam pools. And he goes down there. And after, in this parade was made with Hoshaya and half of the leadership of Yehuda. But Azariah is Ramashulam, and we also had, okay, Azariah is Ramashulam, these are the Kohanim, Yehuda, Vinyaminu, Shmaya, Yirmiyah, Umibnei Kohanim b'chatzotzrot. And then you have the Kohanim who are coming with the trumpets. Who are they? Zechariah ben Yonatan, ben Shmaya, ben Matanya, ben Micha, ben Zakur, ben Asaph. Whenever you have Asaph, you know you're dealing music. Asaph was the chief musician. Vechav and his brethren, Shmaya ve'Ezrael Milai v'Gilai Ma'ai Netanel v'Yehuda v'Chanani b'Chli Shir David Ish Elokim, and they were using the instruments of David. Okay, David went ahead and he established which instruments are going to be used in the Beit HaMikdash. The Ezra Sofer Lifnehem, and leading this parade is Ezra. The Al Shar Ha'ayin V'Negdam, and then if you look at the Shar Ha'ayin, Shar Ha'ayin, we turn the corner. Okay, so we're on the other side here. Shar Ha'ayin is down here, right here is Shar Ha'ayin, okay? And from the Shar Ha'ayin, V'negdam alu al malot Ir David, they went up on the steps of Ir David, b'malel choma me'al Beit David, vad Shar Hamayim Mizrach. And they went all the way up to the Shar Hamayim HaMizrach. They're going uphill, up to the Shar Hamayim, up to here. V'atodah Shenit, and the second group, Ha'olechet Lemol V'ani Achareh, was going on the opposite side and says, Nechemia, I led that one. So he gave the first cover to Ezra. Now he takes the second one. V'chatzi ha'am me'al choma me'al migdal hatanurim, and they went up by the migdal hatanurim. Remember, first group is going this way. Second group is going to meet them, so they're going in the opposite direction. And he says they go mi'al l'migdal ha'tanamim v'ad ha'chomar ha'chava, and until the broad wall. We know the broad wall. We have the broad wall. We have sections of it. That's in the old city. They go ahead until then. Ume'al l'shar Ephraim, and then they get to Shar Ephraim. Ve'al hashar yeshana v'al shar hadagim, and they get to Shar Hadagim. You see, Shar Hadagim is all the way up here. Is at the top of the map. Migdal Chananel is right next to Shar Dagim, the citadel there. Migdal Hamea, and the Migdal Hamea is also at the top of the map, the north end. Ve'ad Shar Hatzon, and all the way to the gate, the sheep's gate. Ve'amdu b'Shar Hamatara, and they waited and they stood at the Shar Hamatara. Now, v'ta'amodna. And then these two offerings or these two groups of people came into the Beit HaMikdash. And they enter into the Beit HaMikdash. Says Nechemia, I got half of the people with me, the other half are with Ezra. And then when it comes to the Kohanim, Eliakim, Asayah, Minyamin, Michaya, they got the trumpets. You can hear the singers that are going on. And also the one who was over this responsibility was from the Kohanim, Yizrachiyah. And now we come to the ceremony. And that day, Bayomahu Zvachim Gedolim, they offered many offerings, Vayismachu, and they rejoiced. Ki Elokim simcha gedola, because God gave them this great joy. V'gam hanashim v'yeladim samechu, and this event involved not just the men, but involved women and children as well. V'tishama simchat Yerushalayim merachok, and you could hear the joy from a distance. Look at the number of times that we talk the word joy. Vayismechu, simcham, simcha, samechu, simchat. 5 times in one pasuk, you have the word simcha. Obviously, that's the driving piece of all of this, the simcha itself. That's the dedication of the walls. So the way they dedicated the walls, first of all, they purified the walls and the gates. There must have been some kind of sprinkling that took place, because part of a purification process is sprinkling either of blood or sprinkling of water. In addition to that, they had a parade, and the parade was on top of the walls. One group, Ezra's group, the primary group, went this way. Nechemia's group went this way. They met at the Beit HaMikdash. The ceremony with singing and with musical instruments, the musical instruments of David HaMelech, where we, once again, going back to David and Shlomo, we talk about that. That's taking place in the Beit HaMikdash. The walls have now been dedicated. Now, if the walls are dedicated, there's one last thing that needs to take place, and that's going to be finalizing all of the various innovations of Nechemia, all of the takanot that we did. Some of them we've already described, because we talked about them earlier when we were talking about some of the changes that would take place. And this goes back a couple of prakim, but here it's taking effect. And so in Pasuk Mem Daled, and this will continue until the end of Yud Gimel, until Pasuk Lamed Aleph of Yud Gimel, we're going to be finalizing all of those various legislation that Nechemia had been in charge of. But we'll start it out as follows. Vayipakdu bayom hahu, and on that day, there were people appointed. Alahan nishachot, la'otzarot, l'trumot, l'reshit, v'la'masrot. On that day, there were people who were appointed over the offices. Nishachot and lishpot are the same word. They were the offices, the storehouses, l'otzarot. What was the purpose? For the truma that was being brought to the Beit HaMikdash, the bikurim that was being brought to the Beit HaMikdash, the maaser lichnos behem l'sdei harim minaot haTorah, and they were being gathered from all of the areas outside from the fields, the portions that were identified by the Torah, la kohanim v'la-levim. These were portions that were going to be distributed to the kohanim and levim, ki simchat Yehuda la kohanim v'la-levim ha'umdim, because the simcha was to be able to support the kohanim and levim who were working in the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore these gifts that were available for them were brought to the Beit HaMikdash and distributed there for the people who were working. Vayishmeru mishmeret Elokehem umishmeret haTorah. And they went ahead and they kept the watch of God. Now, the watch of God refers to bringing the korbanot, bringing the offerings, umishmeret haTorah, and the purity that had to exist. V'hameshorim v'hashorim k'mitzvat David, Shlomo v'no. Both those who were singing, those who were responsible over the gates, just as David HaMelech had taught him, and just as Shlomo, his son, had taught them. There's an understood word, David u'Shlomo b'no. Kivi made David the Asaf Mikedem, because we're going to go back to the times of David and Asaf, the choir master, Rosh HaMeshorim, who was the head of these singers, V'shir Tila v'hodot leLokim. Those were the ways that they would go ahead and they would offer the songs to and the praises to God. V'chol Yisrael b'yimei Zerubbabel v'yimei Nechemia notnim minayot hameshorim v'ashorim dvar yom b'yomo. And in the time of Zerubbabel, because of these innovations that took place, the idea of bringing what needed to be brought was brought daily. Umakdishim la'leviim, and they were brought and sanctified to the Leviim. Interestingly, Makdishim in this case was being brought, they were being turned over to the Leviim, Va'leviim Makdishim livnei Aaron. And the Leviim would then give to what was necessary to Aaron's sons. Notice this is a small little shift. This is part of what Nechemia is trying to do. The Leviim now have a very central role. They're going to be keeping these storehouses, and the storehouses are going to be supporting Kohanim and Leviim. Kohanim have to have their role. Kohanim have to do what Kohanim are supposed to do. But Leviim are being elevated throughout this process, both when Nechemia calls the Leviim to come from the suburbs, to come to Yerushalayim, I need you here for this, and now this role that the Leviim are going to be accomplishing. We're going to stop here. We're going to pick up next week with the last Sefer. And for everybody, whether you're online or in person, I'm open to ideas of what we should be learning next after this. It'll come out in 2 weeks. We're supposed to start something new. So if anyone has ideas, please feel free to share them. You can send me an email, or you can see me at some point and let me know what you want to do. We'll stop here for today. Everyone should have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
What are you interested in?